If, like me, prior to my diagnosis, you've ever spent years feeling like everyone else was handed a manual for life that you never received, you were constantly performing a version of yourself that wasn't quite real, social situations left you exhausted in ways you couldn't explain to anyone, you were somehow broken but couldn't figure out why, then this video might be one of the most important things you watch, because today we're talking about late diagnosed autism, and specifically about that profound, often overwhelming moment when everything you've ever experienced suddenly makes complete and total sense. I'm a chartered psychologist, and I'm also a late diagnosed autistic woman. What I'm going to share with you today comes from both my professional training and my deeply personal lived experience. And yes, I did say chartered psychologist. I've spent years studying human behaviour, supporting clients through some of the most complex psychological challenges imaginable, and it still took me years into my career before I finally understood why I struggle the way I do. That's not a confession of failure, it's actually one of the most important things I can tell you, because it just shows how invisible this can be, even to the people who are supposed to know about these things, particularly for women, particularly for those of us who learned very early to hide every single trace of who we actually are. Let's start at the beginning. For so many autistic adults who receive their diagnosis later in life, there is this extraordinary and often emotional experience of looking backwards. You receive a diagnosis, or you begin to seriously suspect that you might be autistic, and suddenly your entire history reorganises itself. I remember wondering why I didn't understand the jokes that others seemed to grasp so easily when I was little and growing up. And I felt deeply awkward in all kinds of social situations. I would carefully observe how people around me behaved so that I could learn how I was expected to act. Perhaps you also recognise those confusing childhood memories, that friendship that fell apart in ways you never understood, that time at school when you felt completely overwhelmed by something everyone else seemed fine with, that job you lost, that relationship that ended, the years of anxiety, the exhaustion, the deep and aching sense of being different without actually being able to name why. It all slots into place. It is genuinely one of the most profound psychological experiences I have ever encountered, both personally and professionally. But let's be clear about something first. Autism is not a new phenomenon. It's not a modern invention or trend. It's a neurodevelopmental difference. That means that the brain is wired differently. It processes information differently. It interacts with the world differently. And for decades, the clinical picture of autism was drawn almost entirely from research on young white boys. And the diagnostic criteria around autism were built around a very specific presentation. And anyone who didn't fit that narrow template was frequently missed, misdiagnosed, or dismissed altogether. And this is where the work of researchers and advocates, for example, Sarah Hendricks, has been incredibly valuable. Sarah Hendricks, who is also autistic herself, she's done some groundbreaking work in exploring how autism presents in women in particular and girls, and her work has fundamentally changed the conversation, highlighting so many differences. And because autism in women looks different, often very completely different to the textbook version that most clinicians were trained to recognise, this is really important. So where a young autistic boy might resist social interaction, or he might display obviously rigid behaviour, an autistic girl actually often does the opposite. She watches, she studies, she practices, and she mimics, just like I did. She learns often from very young age to perform neurotypicality so convincingly that even the professionals around her don't see what's actually happening underneath. And this is what we call masking. And I want to spend some time on this, because if you're a woman who has come to this video wondering whether any of this applies to you, masking is probably the concept that is going to feel the most immediately recognisable. Masking is the process of consciously or unconsciously suppressing your natural autistic responses and replacing them with socially acceptable behaviour, learned socially acceptable behaviour, I might add. And it might look like forcing eye contact, even though it feels deeply uncomfortable. It might look like scripting conversations in your head before you have them. That's another one I used to do a lot. It might look like spending the entire duration of a social event smiling and engaging and performing, and then coming home and collapsing completely. It is exhausting in a way that is very difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced it. And the cruel thing is, the better you are at it, the harder it becomes to get any support, because to the outside world, you look completely fine. I did this for years and I became an expert at it, outwardly at least. I became so good at it that I went into psychology, which is actually something worth talking about for a moment. When I look at the neurodivergent community and the psychological profession, there is a pattern I find genuinely fascinating. Psychology and professions like it actually attract a disproportionate number of neurodivergent people. And when you think about it, it makes a certain kind of sense. If you spent your whole life not intuitively understanding the unwritten rules of human interaction, studying those rules formally, academically, scientifically becomes a logical compensatory strategy. You are essentially trying to learn consciously what neurotypical people seem to absorb automatically. So I went into psychology to understand people, to understand what made them tick, what drove their behaviour, and what lay beneath the surface. And it wasn't till years into my career that I finally turned that professional lens on myself and recognised what I was actually looking at. Of course, that recognition was enormous and complicated. There was grief in it, real significant grief for the younger version of me who had struggled so hard without any framework for understanding why. Grief for the years spent thinking something was fundamentally wrong with me, but alongside that grief, there was also relief. There was the deeply important shift from thinking I am broken to understanding I am different, and that shift matters profoundly. Now, let's talk about some of the specific experiences that many late diagnosed autistic adults recognise when they look back on their lives and in their current lives. Sensory sensitivity is one of the big ones that often gets overlooked in women. And that can be the clothes that feel intolerable, the sounds that were unbearable to you even though no one else seemed to notice them, the lighting that felt assaulting, the smells that made it impossible to concentrate. Sensory processing differences are core to the autistic experience for many people, and yet because they are internally invisible, they are frequently dismissed, even by ourselves. You told yourself you were being dramatic, you pushed through, you added it to the pile of things you were quietly managing that no one else could see. Then there's stimming. Stimming, or self-stimulatory behaviour, is essentially the body's way of regulating the nervous system. It might look like rocking, hand movements, repetitive sounds, hair twirling, that was a big one for me, nail picking, tapping, or any number of other rhythmic movements or behaviour, or repetitive behaviours. In autistic women, it often looks very subtle, and it's frequently dismissed or suppressed through our social conditioning. But stimming serves a real neurological function. It helps process sensory input and regulate the emotional state. And here is something I have learned personally that I now consider genuinely important guidance. When I notice I'm stimming more than usual, I treat it as a signal. It means my system is telling me something. It is a cue from my body that I am reaching capacity and that I need to pull back, create space, and prioritise downtime before things escalate. Because if you don't listen to these signals, what comes next is autistic burnout. And burnout is serious. It is not the same as feeling tired after a busy week. Autistic burnout is a state of deep, pervasive exhaustion that affects our cognitive function, emotional regulation, physical health, and the ability to perform the daily tasks that might normally feel manageable. It can last for weeks, months, or longer, and it often follows a period of prolonged masking where we've been overextending for a long time, tolerating that sensory overload and emotional strain. From the outside, it could look like depression, anxiety, falling apart, which means it frequently gets misidentified and mistreated as these other things. Meltdowns are another experience that many late diagnosed autistic adults recognise in themselves as well when they finally have the language to describe them. So a meltdown is not a tantrum, it is not a choice, It is what happens when the nervous system becomes so overwhelmed that normal regulatory function just breaks down. It might look like crying, shouting, shutting down, or withdrawing completely. In adults, meltdowns are often deeply shameful experiences precisely because we have been told our whole lives that we are too sensitive, too emotional, too much. So having the framework of autism doesn't make meltdowns disappear, but it does allow you to understand them, to predict or manage your triggers better, and put appropriate support in place. So what does supporting yourself actually look like? And this is where I really want to get practical, because I have spent years, honestly, quite a lot of years, experimenting and adjusting and learning what actually helps me to function well. One of the most significant changes I have ever actually made was switching to a ketogenic diet. Now, I know that might sound like an unexpected thing to hear from a psychologist, but the research on ketogenic nutrition and neurological function is really compelling, and my personal experience has been transformative. Since making that change, I am calmer. My energy is more consistent, and that's been huge. I do not hit that wall of total exhaustion anywhere near as quickly. Autistic burnout, which used to derail me for extended periods, is much less frequent and less severe. And the neurological stability that comes from ketogenic nutrition appears, in my experience, to reduce the overall load on an already taxed nervous system. So I'm not saying it is a cure or that it works identically for everyone. What I am saying that if you are autistic and you're struggling with energy, mood stability and burnout, it is absolutely worth exploring. If you are autistic and you're struggling with energy, mood stability and burnout, it is absolutely worth exploring. But I also want to be honest with you, even with a ketogenic diet, I still have to pay attention. I still have to notice signals. I still have to respect my own limits. And when I find myself stimming more, when sensory input starts to feel sharp and irritating rather than manageable, when I notice my patience for social interaction running thin, faster than usual, those are the cues. And my response to those cues now is very different from what it used to be. Rather than pushing through and hoping I can hold it together, I create space. And self-care for autistic adults looks different from the generic advice that you will see plastered across all these wellness boards and groups. It is not necessarily about bubble baths or scented candles, though for some people, sensory self-care of that kind is genuinely good and valid and helpful. For me, and for many autistic adults though, self-care is about sensory regulation and intentional recovery. It might mean spending time in a quiet, low stimulation environment. It might mean engaging with a deep interest, one of those absorbing topics or activities that feel really genuinely restorative rather than effortful. It might mean reducing social commitments during a period of heightened stress. It might mean creating very predictable routines so that that cognitive load of navigating daily life is reduced. It might mean being honest with the people around you about what you need, even if that honesty is uncomfortable or unfamiliar. There's other things like weighted blankets, ear defenders, carefully curated environments, clear boundaries around social exposure, time in nature, and movement that feels regulating rather than exerting and punishing. So these are not luxuries. For an autistic nervous system, they are genuine necessities. Now I want to move on to something I mentioned at the beginning that I think deserves real attention. In my work as a psychologist, one of the areas I specialise in is family estrangement. And over the years, I've noticed a pattern that I think is really important to name, even though the formal research in this specific area doesn't exist at the moment. From my clinical and anecdotal experience, there is a noticeably higher incidence of family estrangement in situations where one or more family members has a diagnosis or autism, or where autism is perhaps suspected quite strongly, but perhaps not diagnosed. Now, this makes a certain kind of psychological sense when you consider what we know about autistic experience within families. When someone is autistic and undiagnosed, particularly in families where the condition is not understood or acknowledged, the interactions can be persistently painful. Communication differences get misread as rudeness or indifference. Sensory and social needs that are legitimate get dismissed as difficult behaviour or manipulation. I see that a lot. The autistic family member may have spent years literally being misunderstood, criticised, or made to feel fundamentally wrong in ways that actually accumulate into real damage. And sometimes for an autistic adult who has finally received a diagnosis and begun to understand themselves more fully, The realisation that certain family relationships have been actively harmful becomes impossible to ignore. This does not mean estrangement is inevitable or always the right outcome, but it does mean that if you're navigating family estrangement and autism is part of your story, there is an important and specific lens through which to understand that experience. And if you're a family member on the other side of an estrangement involving someone who may be autistic or is diagnosed, understanding the neurological and relational dimensions of that might be one of the most important things you can do. So if you are a late diagnosed autistic adult, or if you're watching this and beginning to wonder whether this might be your story, I want you to hear something that took me a long time to truly believe. There is nothing wrong with you. There has never been anything wrong with you. You are not broken. You are not deficient. You are not too much or not enough. You are a person whose brain works differently, who was probably never given the right framework to understand that difference, and who has been working incredibly hard, often invisibly, for a very long time. The exhaustion you have felt is real. The confusion is real. The grief that comes with late diagnosis is a real and valid and deserving of compassion. But also, so is the relief. And so is the possibility of finally building a life that actually works with who you are rather than against it. Understanding yourself is not the end of the journey. It is genuinely the beginning of a different and better one. If this video resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it and come back, because we're just getting started on this.